in 2011. And I'd like to welcome Professor Donald Linebaugh to the podium.
Thank you, Jamie. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, then I'll not use the microphone. If there is any problem, just raise a hand and I'll try to speak up. So the Springfield Gas Machine is an amazing system that I'm going to go over tonight. Talk to you a little bit about the business history of the company, because it's a pretty extraordinary business history story. Talk about the technical history of the machine itself, which uses liquid gasoline starting right after the Civil War, so at a time when gasoline was literally a byproduct being thrown away, well before the internal combustion engine. And then finally talk about the social history, how this system affected social activities in various settings. So if I can get this thing working here. So the company, like many in the mid-19th century, started as a partnership with the inventor John Barker, who was a Massachusetts native. And Barker was a machinist, inventor. By the turn of the century, he had like 85 patents or something like that. And he partnered up with Charles Gilbert from the Midwest, who was primarily a salesman and an entrepreneur. And that's very typical of partnerships in the mid-19th century, is this connection of inventor and builder with salesperson. So we see that a lot. So businessman Gilbert, and then this combination of the two being very typical of how that process works. The other thing that happens in the late 19th century is the rise, of course, of corporations. And Gilbert and Barker did become a corporation in the late 19th century as well, although it stayed, it still had a flavor of sort of a family organization up through the end of the 19th century. But with corporations, particularly gas companies and later electric companies, people were initially very wary. They were very wary of corporations anyways, because of the sort of power that corporations had and displayed in many ways. But also, in the case of these utility companies, they literally sort of inserted themselves into your home and into your life, right, through a pipe or through a wire. And so this idea of the reach of the corporation into the private domain really bothered people, and you read a lot about people being concerned about that. And so one of the things that Gilbert and Barker did was they advertised their system as a way to be your own gas company, to be your own gas company president, and avoid the corporate tentacles coming in and taking over your house. They were really, in many ways, sort of marketing geniuses, and I think this is probably largely Gilbert here. So they established sales offices in New York City, Philadelphia, Springfield, Boston, Midwest, and all the way to the West Coast, and began distributing circulars and advertising materials to sell the machine. Actually, let me go back one here. One of their methods, and again, this was fairly typical of the 19th century, was the idea of sort of cross-selling. So in this case, the owner of Poole and Hunt, which is a large foundry in Baltimore, Maryland, put one of the machines, a 75 light machine, in his dwelling, and they note it induced us to introduce it in our works. So the owner of the company tried one out, liked it, put it in the works. Sometimes it went the other way, and the company bought it, and then we find a whole bunch of people in the top echelon of the company putting it in their country houses or the like. The other thing they did was they touted people, the great and famous of the time, as using their system. So this gentleman, P.T. Barnum, whom I'm sure most of you have heard of, right, was a big name in the mid-19th century with his American Museum and, of course, later his various circus organizations and the like. So really, they relied on a sort of celebrity endorsement kind of approach, right? While they made gas machines and they sold gas machines, their main product was not the machine, it was the supply for the machine. And this was a model invented by Gillette with the Gillette razor, right? How many of you spend a lot of money on razor blades today, right? What other modern company uses the same idea?
HP.
Right, printers, right? Buying toner. You can almost get a printer for free, right? But then you pay, 80 or 90 bucks a toner. Well, Gilbert and Barker were very smart. Most of the companies that made these systems just sold the machines, but they sold the gasoline as well, and they retained the rights to sell the gasoline for these machines, which was really important because it was hard to get gasoline at that time. But it turned out that it was the main profit motive. And so by 1800, they were selling 3 million gallons of gasoline a year, which doesn't sound like a lot in today's sense with cars and all. But keep in mind that there were no cars, right? This was literally the only use for liquid gasoline at this point. Gasoline was a byproduct of the refining of crude oil into kerosene, which was the principal lighting fuel of the time. They were literally they had pipes out of the refinery that just dumped the gasoline because there was not a lot of use for gasoline at that point. So they took this underused commodity and commodified it and turned it in essentially to a gold mine. So it's probably not surprising to you then that in the year 1884, they were purchased by the Standard Oil Trust, Mr. Rockefeller's little group, who were interested in companies that were making systems that used their fuel, that used their oil. So they became a subsidiary of Standard Oil. And I'm just on the bottom here, it's a little hard to read, but the name there is H.M. Flagler. Remember that name a little later. He was the secretary of Standard Oil Trust at the time. You might recognize this guy too, this Edison gentleman, who, of course, introduces the electric lamp about halfway through the life cycle of the Springfield Gas Machine, in competition, of course, with the gas machine. Ironically, at the very same time that he's patenting the electric light, Edison is lighting his home in New Jersey with a Springfield gas machine. And in fact, he's lighting his laboratory in New Jersey that he used to invent the electric light with a Springfield gas machine. So there's a really interesting dynamic going on here. But the company responded. They had to respond because as electricity came online in the 1880s and picked up speed in the 1890s, they really saw the potential for it to affect their sales, of course. So they innovated and came up with products to try to make gas light as close to electric light as possible in terms of quality. So one of the things they invented, Barker got a patent in 1899 for a incandescent gas light, which used a mantle. For those of you that have seen a Coleman lantern, right, that uses a gas mantle, which is a little fabric that glows, and it basically doubles or triples the amount of light quality. So it allows the gas light to be as bright or brighter than an electric light. So it really was this sort of product innovation that kept the company going They continued to sell Springfield Gas Machines up until 1918. And we know of Springfield Gas Machines running all the way up to the 1950s. I'll show you one in a little while, which is kind of wild to think about. Okay, so just a little quick information on gas. So gas light is primarily an urban lighting source between about 1820 and 1860, right? Gas companies put their plant in the middle of the city, and they sell gas, based on installing infrastructure, which is very expensive, pipes, etc. So it really doesn't go out of the city. It doesn't become a rural phenomenon at all, okay? And most small towns don't have gas plants during this time. So really, anybody in the rural area before about 1860 is using primarily tallow oil type lamps, whale oil type lamps, or candles. That's it. Now with the discovery of oil and processing of oil in the 1850s and 1860s, we start getting kerosene lamps come online. And kerosene remains the major lighting source for the rural part of our country up into the first quarter of the 20th century, okay? Until really rural electrification takes over. Because most people can't afford systems like the Springfield, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. But basically, by the mid part of the 19th century, kerosene comes in. Of course, kerosene is being produced, I mentioned earlier, as it's being produced, what's called the light fraction of distillation is being thrown away. That's gasoline, benzene, and these kind of light, very volatile chemicals, okay? So gasoline doesn't have a lot of use, and this is when these designers in the Springfield system say, what about people that are outside of the reach of the urban gas company and want to have good light, okay? And that's when their system kind of comes to the fore. The other thing, of course, during this period, gas, during this period is people are really quite afraid of it, frankly. Both coal gas and natural gas and gasoline. It looks like water, but they find out that it's not like water, right? And there's some terrible, you read in the paper almost every day if you search for gas and explosions together in the New York Times historical, you come up with literally hundreds of very serious explosions. One of my favorites is this guy in Cincinnati. I don't think I have it up there, but he goes down into the basement of the city hall because they were having a council meeting and the gas lights on a gas machine went out. So he went down in the basement to check on it with a lit cigar. And they basically found him in Kentucky, I think. Parts of him anyways. It was not pretty. So this, this whole idea of the concern about gas also sort of slowed down the spread of gasoline, particularly to rural areas. So the concern was this idea of literally having gasoline in your house. The early design of these machines required you to basically have what some people have called a big metal Molotov cocktail in your basement, right? Because it's got a tank of gas and it has this air tank next to it that's being used to make the system work, right? The way it works is the air pump blows air over the gasoline, and the gasoline picks up the air picks up the gasoline vapor, and it was then pumped by that air pump into the house, okay? So people didn't want this in their basement. So if you didn't put it in your basement, what was the option? Well, They sold it as being able to put in your garage or put in a little house outside of your house a little ways away so that it was safe. Well, that's great, except that when the weight comes down, you have to go out and wind it. And that's okay for if you're in Georgia, but if you're in New England, it's not very effective, right? The other problem is this air pump actually is filled halfway with water to create the vacuum that's needed for the air to be pumped, right? And what happens, of course, with water in New England in the winter? It freezes, right? So it was very impractical. And they found out, they introduced this first design, and many other companies were doing the same thing, gasoline pump together. And they found out that it just wasn't selling. And I've actually got some early company records that talk about, you know, the sales are miserable. We've got to come up with something else. And the something else that they came up on was remarkably simple. And it was patentable. They got a patent for separating the air pump and the gasoline tank. And it was a patent that they maintained for the rest of their time in business. Just taking those two things apart. So that the air pump would be in the basement where you could go down, wind it up, it would stay warm, it wouldn't freeze. And the gasoline, which people were afraid of, was put into an underground container, a brick vault, that was anywhere from, we find them anywhere from about 50 to 100 feet away from the building. So if something did happen, you're going to be okay, right? So the way the system works then is you wind up the weight, which is handle right here, crank it up, the weight goes up, and as the weight then starts to drop, it spins the pump, and that pump is going to start sending air out into the tank, and as it goes through the tank, it's going to go back and forth across a series of pans that have gasoline in them, picking up gasoline vapor, and then it's going to go back into the house and right up the piping system into the house to supply the gas fixtures, right? Now, if the fixtures are closed and you're not using the gas, which is, you know, most of the time actually, right? In the middle of the day, you're not using any gas. So you shut off all the gas cocks. What happens is as this drops, it pressurizes the system. And when the system gets at a certain pressure, you get stasis. So the weight quits dropping, okay? Because it can't force any more air through the system. So the system just sits there and waits. And when you open a gas cock and start bleeding air pressure off, the system starts working again. So it's really quite ingenious. And it resulted in only having to wind the pump about once a week for the average household. So it wasn't really a very onerous process. This is what the actual gas generator looked like. It was a series of pans that were about 2 inches deep, filled with water. And the more evaporating surface you got, the richer the mixture you could get, and the better the system would work. The pump, as I said, gets wound up, weight goes up. These are about 1,000-pound concrete weights that drive the system, and it's really only producing about 10 to 15 pounds of pressure, not a lot of pressure. It's a very low speed process, actually. They also invented some hydraulic blowers for mills and other large industrial settings. Here's one of these wind-up systems. This is a guy in 1957 who was the maintenance man at a school in Massachusetts, a boys' school, that still had one of these systems in operation. They weren't using it for lighting, but they were using it for the Bunsen burners in their chemistry laboratory up until 1957, which is pretty amazing. One of the big innovations that they came up with that allowed them to compete against electricity, making this all work more easily, was this air pump that used pressurized water. So if you had a source of pressurized water, you could use this air pump and eliminate the need to wind it up and have weights and all that other stuff. And it was very simple. If you had water running, it turned this water wheel, it created air pressure, and this little reservoir moved up. And as that reservoir moved up, it shut off that little valve that you see up there at B, almost like a float in the tank of your toilet, right? As the water comes up, it shuts it off. So it would shut it off when it got pressurized. And then again, as you start using air pressure to run your system, and that top part drops, it would turn the water back on again, and the system would start up. So it was completely automatic at that point, which was a big innovation for the company. They also, at the same time, developed something called the mixing regulator, which was really important because one of the big problems these systems had was keeping the mixture of air and gasoline vapor at the right level. If you had too much gasoline vapor, you were going to get a really smoky burn, not a very good burn. Sort of like if you turn a kerosene lamp up too high, you get that kind of black, sooty stuff. So this was a very similar situation. And so you wanted to keep the mixture 85% air, 15% gasoline. And Barker developed this mixing regulator that automatically kept that at the right percentage. And between that and the automatic air pump, you literally, the only thing you had to do was fill the tank with gasoline, and light the fixtures. That was it. There was really no other maintenance. So it became a very simple system to use. It used both plain gas burners, probably very similar to what would have been on the lights in this room, a flat flame burner. And then, as I mentioned, they used the later Springfield mantle type burners. The other thing they did was created a whole group of household products that could be run off this, right? Because we needed to make mother's work easier, right? There's actually been a couple of great books written on this whole rise of different types of appliances to make women's work easier, which in fact only added to the complexity of what, because now it might be easier to heat the iron, but now you were expected to do more things because you had that ease of the iron. So you had things like irons, you had an instant hot water heater, so that it came on automatically and just delivered the amount of hot water you needed, which of course we now think of as a recent innovation that you can buy. Room heaters, all types, hot water heaters, even fireplace inserts run by the Springfield Gas Machine in the 1870s, which is pretty interesting. So that gives you a sense of the system itself, right? A pretty simple piece of machinery that had the potential to make quite a difference. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of labor and business use, then I'll talk about suburban and domestic use of the system, and also the sort of urban and rural disparities in lighting. Many large firms use the system. Poole and Hunt Foundry, which was one of the largest iron foundries in Maryland at the time, actually cast some of the columns for the U.S. Capitol building, had 250 workers, something like that, on site, used it to light their entire works. The New England Pin Company in Connecticut, which was making something like 2 million straight pins a day. These were big production facilities. So, and they were also corporations investing capital. If you're investing large amounts of capital in your equipment, what do you want to be able to do with that equipment?
Use it.
Use it, right. You want to keep it working all the time, because if it's not working, it's not generating income on your capital, right? And so something as simple as shortened light hours in the winter meant reduced production, right? So the idea of being able to light these large factories really transformed and literally lengthened the working day, which was great for the owners, usually not so great for the workers who were being paid by the day. So their day stayed, they still got their 15 whatever per day for doing their work. So it really had a big impact on efficiency, and that had sort of dual ramifications. It also, though, had an impact on worker safety, because most of the equipment being used in these mills, this is long before OSHA, these large spinning looms that children as young as 10 and 12 were working around, when you were in a darkened mill building, as you move to the center of the building, there's no other light but natural light. And working on these incredibly fast-moving machines was extremely dangerous, and there were a lot of accidents. So increasing light really had a big part in improving worker safety, and really was the way that many folks that were in the sort of middle to lower income scale were introduced to gas light, other than in public spaces and public buildings, because they certainly couldn't afford it themselves, but it made a difference for sure. The company, because they were so interested in selling to large mills and the like, when they invented their incandescent light, they realized that the shaking of a mill building was going to just destroy the mantles, and so they had to come up with a system. So they developed this, patented this system with a spring and a rubber hose to kind of dampen the movement of the mill building, which again indicates their sort of focus on and understanding of a particular clientele that they were trying to sell to. So some nearby firms that used them, Stevens and Thompson wallpaper mills in Hoosick Falls. This is 1884, a very large concern. And you see here, it notes that the lights for the plant are gasoline, but also that at night they have 12 hands who are working. Now, those 12 hands, what they're working on at night is not production. They're working on machine maintenance, which if they couldn't do that at night, had to be done at the beginning or the end of the day, and that meant production time was decreased. So it really had a huge impact on production efficiency, for sure. And eventually ended up with second shifts and third shifts. That the whole idea of multiple shifts was made possible by improvements in lighting quality, which transformed a lot of social relations. Interestingly, at the same time that the wallpaper plant was using a Springfield Gas Machine, right across the river from them, they're over on this side of the river, is a gas lighting company. So why didn't they hook into the gas pipe? A couple of possibilities. One is, I don't know if the pipe was running under the river at that time. But the other thing was, the company really focused on this issue of cost and quality. The light that would have been produced by a gas light company like this was called coal gas. It was basically made by taking coal and burning it and driving off the hydrocarbons and capturing that gas, okay? And depending on how well you did at separating out all the impurities, that coal gas could either be really good or it could be really bad. And from the reading I've done, a lot of it was pretty mediocre. And so it didn't produce very good light quality. And And they also charged almost 3 times as much as gasoline was costing. So there was both a cost and a quality aspect to this that was important. When we think about gas today, we think about natural gas. Natural gas isn't used for lighting at all because natural gas produces a blue flame like when you turn on your stove, and it doesn't produce enough lumens to be used for lighting. So natural gas that we use today has never been used as a lighting fuel. Philmont, New York, not too far from here, which I now, after looking at all the mills that were located there, call the underwear capital of New York. They were making shirts and drawers, as they said. But all of the factories there were lighting with the Springfield Gas Machine. You can see the gas house where the Springfield machine was set up, some distance away from the main mill. The Summit Knitting, similar thing, using the Springfield. High Rock Knitting Company, producing 225 dozen shirts and drawers in a 10-hour shift, right? Springfield Gas Machine in the center. And we actually have a letter from the company, and they talk about having used the Springfield system for over 20 years. And interestingly, in addition to 300 lights in the mill, they're using it to light their residences. And in this case, the residences are probably this group of workers' housing tenements down here, and a series, these are probably supervisor dwellings. And then also a series of larger homes that included the home of one of the Harder sons that we know was lit with the system. So it really was quite a complex. But the idea that workers were having light supplied in their company-owned housing was pretty novel for that period, quite. The Royal Ponciana, another use in addition to business was hotels and the whole rise of tourism that was occurring in the mid-19th century with the increase in rail travel and the like. So this is down in West Palm Beach. Anybody know who built the Royal Ponciana? Flagler, right. Henry Flagler, the former secretary of Standard Oil. When he left Standard Oil, he bought the Florida East Coast Railroad, and he started building large tourist hotels. The Royal Ponciana was a 3,000-room hotel, and every one of those rooms had lights. So the gas system there ran over 3,000 individual gas fixtures. We think it held about, based on the calculations I've done, about 10,000 gallons of gasoline to fill this thing up and make this system work. So it was pretty amazing stuff. The other thing that gas light allowed, and the Springfield machine in particular for these hotels, was a transformation in hotel design. Up to this point, we had what were called single corridor construction, okay? So you would have a group of rooms along one side, which had windows, and you would have a hallway that accessed those rooms, and that hallway would have windows on the outside, so the hallway could be lit, right? So the idea of what we call a double-loaded corridor, where we have a hallway that has no natural light capability, is only possible with good interior lighting that's brought about by systems like gas light, okay? So this is the first time when we get these new gas lighting systems that we see this new hotel design that we, of course, still see today. You can imagine going into the Hampton Inn next time and there being no light in the hallway, right? You know, not a good thing. So this idea of quality light was essential to this transformation. And just a couple of images. This was sort of the main entry room where you landed, and I've counted there's about 20 gaslight fixtures. So they talk about, there's actually a couple of neat travelers' accounts of arriving at these places at night. And, you know, people talk about the amazement of the bright light shining out. And, you know, it was like going from night to day, which was an amazing transformation for people in that time period. Their dining room, which seated 1,000 people, had these huge fixtures that produced an amazing quality of light. The Red Lion Inn, not too far from here in Stockbridge, used one of these Springfield gas machines, and I knew that it was using a Springfield gas machine, and I was driving by, and so on a whim I stopped, and I went in and I asked the local, or the hotel's maintenance guy. I said, do you know anything about this gas lighting system? And he looked at me like, you know, where are you from? Looked at my license plate, and I wasn't from around there. And, you know, what do you really want? Why do you want to go down in the basement and look in this hotel? But he took me around anyways. He became intrigued, and we started poking around the basement. And in the very back corner of the basement, we found, and he had never seen these, he had been there 26 years, the original pump and mixing regulator that were still exactly where they had been, completely hooked up, almost ready to start up again, and that they had no knowledge of. This hotel was interesting because they didn't light the individual rooms. They only lit the public spaces. And if you think about it, in the sort of third quarter of the 19th century, how much time did you spend in your hotel room? Not a lot. There weren't TVs, there weren't radios. If you were going to read or you were going to do anything like that, you were in one of the public rooms, one of the library, the parlor, et cetera, et cetera. So it really was a sort of a different way of using the hotel. And it's reflected in their installation. So it was pretty cool to see these things still sitting there. Howe's Cave, not too far from here as well, in 1872 installed a Springfield system that lit both the cave house and 1.5 miles of the cave. The New York Times reported in 1873, or actually this is from one of the company publications, that they lit the cave and the entrance to the cave. The New York Times in 1874 says to increase the novelty, means have recently been taken to use gas as far as the lake, this being the only cave in the world that is lighted with gas. So a real sort of innovative use of this system that really wouldn't have been possible any other way to have gas lighted. And in fact, they, in all their literature, they touted that they were the only cave in the world lighted with gas. So the idea of quality gas light as an amenity that you could advertise became pretty standard. The Grand Union Hotel here in Saratoga Springs used not a Springfield system, I found out, but it used a gas light system. Turns out if you look at, these are Sanborn fire insurance maps, by the way, if you're not familiar with those. They were produced from the 1870s up until the 1940s and 50s. And they map and they rate buildings by fire, how much fire risk there is, so that insurance companies can decide how much they want to charge you for your fire insurance. But they're great because something like a Springfield gas machine, which had gasoline, was a fire risk. So it shows up all the time on these things. And if we look at that detail, it says gas for supply of hotel is made in a gas house at the rear of the St. James Hotel. So then I had to do a little more investigating, and I found out that the St. James was right across the street, the Grand Union being up there, and here are the two gas houses that were running that large hotel. Turned out that it was a competitor to Gilbert and Barker. In fact, it was Gilbert and Barker's first engineer who had left the company to found his own gas machine company, a guy by the name of Hiram Maxim. Anybody know what the name Maxim goes with? He's the gentleman who right before World War I invented the Maxim machine gun and transformed warfare in the early 20th century. That's really what he's known for. But he really was a gas machine guy prior to making the machine gun. So again, the Grand Union uses this double corridor construction, this double loaded construction, because it has that availability of good quality light. Let's see. There we go. So some images of the interior showing large chandeliers, or gasoliers, not unlike the ones we have in this room. 5 years later, we've got both an electric and gas company operating here in Saratoga Springs. So probably concurrently with the Grand Union using that system for themselves. Probably a cost or quality difference. Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts used a system that actually lit all 13 buildings on campus. Again, I showed up unannounced, found the maintenance guy. We went out, we did a little digging. We actually found the system completely intact, including the 8,000-gallon gasoline tank, which has now been remediated. And I'm not invited back to Mount Holyoke very often. No, I'm just kidding. But anyways, they lit all their buildings. And some amazing fixtures. This fixture is about 8 feet across, and it has 80 individual gas lights. This was in their gymnasium. There were 2 of these things hanging in the gymnasium. So it must have just been amazing when these things were cranked up. But Mount Holyoke, in their little catalog that they used to advertise to students, made a point of talking about fine buildings with modern improvements for light and heat. So they were touting the fact that they had the latest technology to try to attract students, not unlike what we do today in higher education. There it is up close, of course, been electrified. The Murdoch School, which is a small public school in Massachusetts, again, it was used in a lot of different installations. This is a hanging chandelier. It was used in the chemistry lab, so these are gas Bunsen burners that were attached for chemistry class, which is kind of cool. All still there and intact. In fact, it's not used as a school any longer. Churches used the system as well. This is the Unity Church, which was built by the Ames family of the Ames Tool Company, who installed a system in 1875 and had custom-made lighting for the church. And then a little closer to home in Salem, New York, the First Methodist Episcopal Church used Springfield Gas Machine, and they noted in a letter to the company, "Our church is lighted better than any church in this town." I told my wife that they didn't want to hide their light under a bushel. Oh, sorry. Anyway. So again, this idea of quality of light, and we actually see this, I've seen the same kind of thing in other contexts where churches or other organizations are really using the quality of light as a benchmark for where they are in the community. Okay, finally, suburban development gets affected greatly because up until electrification, the only way people in the suburbs could have good quality lighting is with these small independent gas units like the Springfield, okay? And most of the people that are going to the suburbs originally are going to build country houses like Yaddo here that are outside of the reach of the local gas company. So the only way they can enjoy the same quality light they have when they're living in New York City or in Philadelphia or anywhere else is to have a Springfield gas machine. So the company figures this out pretty quickly, and they actually publish a brochure directed just to people who want to light country homes and suburban homes during this period. So they figure out that sort of niche market. They know they're not going to sell to everybody. These machines cost $500 at a time when $500 was the high end of what the average laborer was earning in a year, right? So the average laborer isn't buying a Springfield gas machine. So they figured out this niche market during this period. And it's all about modern conveniences. So here's a book on, it's called Sound Sense in Suburban Architecture. So it's a book by an architect about how to build fairly inexpensive country, quote unquote, country cottages, right? But Gilbert and Barker is advertising the Springfield gas machine, and Lent is specifically talking about how important it is to pipe your house, whether you're going to put in a gas machine or not when you build it. So the idea that gas is going to be used at some point. So if we think about suburban areas, I did this for Philadelphia. These are all the known locations of Springfield gas machines in dwellings in suburban Philadelphia. What do you think that maps out? Do you see any patterns there? What? Trolley, or in the case of Philadelphia, rail lines, right? So it literally, this one here maps out what's called the main line, which we still talk about today, which was the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad, right? And we were getting this suburban development along these kinds of either trolley or rail service. So we see that in a lot of urban areas. So homes like Frank Godey's, who was one of the publishers of Godey's Ladies Book, which was a very important way to get the word about good lighting out to women who were the keepers of the cult of domesticity, right? Who were really running the household during this period. And John Wanamaker and his son Louis Wanamaker of the very large Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia, who were selling light fixtures that could be used with a Springfield gas machine. So again, this sort of double marketing. We also get the idea of the fixture itself becoming part of interior decoration about this time. So with people like Edith Wharton's very classic book called The Decoration of Housing, she actually is talking about, she says, increasing interest shown in house decoration will in time doubtless cause a demand for better type of gas and electric fixtures. So the idea that the fixture becomes part of the overall interior design really grows during this time. Installations with people like John Sloan. John Sloan ran the Sloan Interior Decorating Firm, which was located on Broadway in New York City and considered these sort of trend makers in interior decoration at the time. So to be able to tout that John Sloan used a Springfield gas machine for his home in Lenox was a big marketing ploy for the gas machine company as well. Here talks about a parlor design for C.F. Clothier. Clothier was one half of the firm of Strawbridge and Clothier, which was the other big Philadelphia department store at the time. We know that C.F. Clothier lit his house with a Springfield gas machine, and all of this is being advertised in Godey's Ladies Book, and we know that Frank Godey is lighting his house with a Springfield. So the idea that this very decorative gasolier is shown here as part of the properly designed and furnished parlor is a really important notion. Yaddo, Spencer Trask's house here in Saratoga Springs, which he purchased in 1881, was lit with a gas machine for at least 22 years, because we have a letter that he sent to the company in 1905. Your gas machine has been in use at Yaddo, my Saratoga country home, for the past 22 years. It's not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's given general satisfaction. But I would counter by saying he installed it in the original house in 1883. That house burned, and he reinstalled it in the new house he built. So he must not have been too uncomfortable with it, because by the time he built his new house in the 1890s, he would have had some other options. He had a gas company here in Saratoga, and of course, electric is not too far down the road, and we'll come back to him in electric in a minute. I think this was supplied by Jamie, and I appreciate that very much. We think this is probably one of the converted gas wall fixtures here. I haven't had a chance to go there and kind of check it out, but there it is. Hillstead House, which was a McKim, Mead, and White structure owned by a steel maker named Alfred Pope, who moved from Cleveland, which incidentally was the same town where Rockefeller and Henry Flagler all lived on the same street next to each other. And he moved out to Connecticut to build his country house and installed these amazing gasoliers that we have a receipt that were designed by Shreve, Crump and Lowe, the Boston jewelry firm. So it really drives home this point that the gasolier becomes part of the interior decoration of the house, and gas is important in that decorative sense. Liberty Hall, this is a little departure, but I had to throw it in because I love the lights that we'll see here. But this was the home of the Vice President of the Confederacy. You know who that was? Stevens, right. Mr. Stevens. This was his home in Crawfordsville, Georgia. And the entire system intact there, still in the gas house. This is now a state park. And I went and did some consulting work with them. They still have the original gas laying fixtures, including this, what's called a drop ferrule, and then a rubber tube that comes down so that you could have what was called a portable. You could have a lamp that you could move around. One of the big things that the early electric lighting companies touted was the fact that you could move electric lights because they were on a cord, right? And so the gas companies quickly followed by coming up with this rubber tube system to have, this was Mr. Stevens' desk lamp, which is an amazing design piece all of its own that was run with gas. Langwater, northeastern Massachusetts. This was the home of the Ames family who built Unity Church that I showed you a little bit earlier. But again, you can see here that the gasoliers are just totally of a piece with this high Victorian interior decoration that we see here, this one in the front in particular. And finally, Sagamore, the home of Alfred Vanderbilt in Racket Lake, built 1896. An amazing place if you haven't been there. A series of about 12 separate buildings that were lit with a Springfield gas machine that I was asked to come up and look at. And in fact, it has two Springfield gas machines because it had so many buildings. It has one installed in what was called the Playhouse and one up in the main lodge. And they are literally completely intact. They asked me if we should try to fire them up again, and I suggested that the insurance companies may not like that so much. But Racket Lake was really out there in the wilderness, even at that time. And Vanderbilt was bringing his sports up from New York for hunting and fishing in the wilderness, but they had to have the absolute pinnacle of lighting and heating and amenities, right, that they enjoyed in their New York City apartments and the like. So here he is. These look like a bunch of people out camping and fishing, right? In their smoking jackets and the like. It's just such a wonderful story. And here they are, the pump and the regulator completely, and all of the underground parts still intact and sort of ready to go. But the other thing about this, when this was installed, the closest train was 15 miles away. So they had to go by train, then by boat, and then they had to portage from one lake to another to get this thing to install it. So, I mean, it was a pretty monumental effort to get this thing there in the first place. And then bringing gasoline, just bringing barrels of gasoline in was pretty amazing as well. So all of the interior fixtures still intact. This is the playhouse. There's also a bowling alley in the back that's lit, completely lit for night bowling, which is pretty cool. These are some of the Gleason company lights, but they have Gilbert and Barker burners on them that we were able to identify. So that gives you a sense of the sort of domestic use. So as, well, I can't think of it, but, Harvey, what's his name? He used to say, and this is the rest of the story.
Paul Harvey.
Paul Harvey, thank you, as Paul Harvey would say. And every story has to have a tag on it. Well, we get back to Edison again. He's involved in this, of course, because electric light does begin to take off and take over in the quality of light. And the company can't compete. It really sees the writing on the wall. And again, ironically, in competition with Edison, who is still using a Springfield gas machine to light his house, and who is being, this is a great quote that I found. So 1898, this really sort of shows the change. A lamp that requires no oil to burn, no matches to light, and does not smoke is the kind of light to have, right? That's electricity. And that's the big transformation that takes place. But again, ironically, of course, Spencer Trask is the principal investor and funder in Edison's work to create the electric light. And both of them are using a Springfield gas machine throughout most of this period to light their own homes. Because early electric is still, we still have the same problems that we have with gas. Infrastructure, just getting the lines strung. And early electric generating capacity is really hit or miss. It's very unreliable. So what we see for a short period of time are what are called combination fixtures. And combination fixtures would be a fixture like this where one of them would still be a gas fixture and the others would be electric. So if the electric company had a problem, you would go down to the basement and you would fire up your Springfield gas machine and you'd light your light. And given that I live on a rural farm in Pennsylvania, I'd really like to have one of those Springfield gas machines again to have a backup system, because when lights go out, you're sort of sunk. So what happens? They realize that Edison is winning the battle for lighting, and they're very innovative again and say to themselves, what do we know how to do? We know how to work with gasoline. What's happening about 1900 that involves gasoline? The car. And when the car comes online, Are there gas stations? No. Are there gas pumps to pump gas? No. None of that is available. Gilbert and Barker very quickly get into the business of making gasoline station gas pumps. And in fact, they're still in business today, located in Greenville, North Carolina. They still make gas station gas pumps. In fact, the next time you go to the gas station, when you pump your gas, look right up there for a little plate that says Gil-Barco, which is the Gilbert and Barker Company, which is the firm that started all this in terms of the Springfield Gas Machine. So they've made, again, this sort of story about business flexibility and transition, an amazing transformation, and are still in business today. Unfortunately, when they moved in 1968 from Springfield, Massachusetts to North Carolina, they put all of their company records in dumpsters and then moved. So they had no records left whatsoever.